and on C-SPAN 2.
Washington Journal continues.
Mr. Scheuer, Michael Scheuer is our guest for the next half hour, and we'll be taking your calls. But I want to start by showing a couple headlines this morning in the papers. This is the Washington Times. Conflicting claims on death of Taliban leader. And on the front page of the New York Times in the inside is this story. Pakistani officials say top militant is killed in succession struggle. There was a death of an al-Qaeda leader, supposedly. Who was that, and how important was he?
Well, it wasn't al-Qaeda, it was the Pakistani Taliban, Batullah Masood, who is their chief. And they're claiming that on Wednesday morning an American drone killed him. The Taliban itself, the Pakistani Taliban, is saying, no, he's alive, and they're going to produce a video to prove that he's alive, but they haven't done it yet. And I think the latest news this morning was there is reported to have been a shootout between people who were vying to succeed him. So it's a very messy situation, but I think at the end of the day, all the indications are that he is dead.
What's the effect of that?
Well, the Pakistani Taliban, of course, is not someone who's fighting the United States at this time. We tend to blend the two, the Afghan and the Pakistani Taliban. The Pakistani Taliban is fighting the Pakistani army at this time. So it will disrupt the activities of the Taliban. But at the end of the day, someone will emerge to take control and will probably settle down into a situation that's roughly similar to the one we were facing before he was killed.
Like you said, Americans tend to blend the two together, yes, very rarely separating. What's the importance of separating them?
Well, it's for one thing, if we're taking the measure of who we're destroying, who's attacking us, then this is not a fellow to put into that category. Batullah Masood has been not fighting us in Afghanistan, he's been fighting the Pakistanis in Pakistan. So there's a clear difference between the two. This is not the killing of a man who will help us get out of Afghanistan anytime soon.
Mr. Scheuer, right now, what's the status of al-Qaeda?
Well, I think
its influence?
Al-Qaeda, clearly, the influence of al-Qaeda is extraordinary in terms of its ability to instigate people to fight in different areas of the world. If you kind of step back from where we are today to where we were at 9/11, we now have insurgencies in southern Thailand, an intensifying one in Mindanao, a very serious problem in Yemen and in Somalia, and a very strong Islamic insurgency in the North Caucasus in the Russian Federation. All of those were either on their deathbed or in a state of near defeat. And al-Qaeda doesn't command any of those. It's not a command and control relationship, but it's the influence of what bin Laden and al-Zawahiri have said and done over the past 15 years.
Why have those insurgencies grown since 9/11?
Well, I think the appeal of a couple of things. The appeal of religion in the Islamic world is very strong. And bin Laden has, if there's a genius about him, it is his ability to focus people on the West's influence in the Muslim world. And we're very active, of course, in Mindanao. We're helping the Filipinos fight their Islamic insurgency. We're very active in Yemen. Of course, we tried to take out the government in Somalia. So part of the reason is our actions. Part of the reason is bin Laden has been a very effective leader, at least in the rhetorical sense, in the Muslim world.
Is bin Laden, in your view, still alive and still in command in some form?
I think, I would say definitely he's still alive. In their culture, in their religion, they would tell us if he was dead, because they would be mourning his death, but they would be celebrating the fact that he had died fighting for God. And we have now a dozen years of records of al-Qaeda never trying to hide the death of anyone. They tell us when somebody dies, and at times often try to rub our face in it by announcing the man's death, naming his successor, and then putting on the internet his curriculum vitae to show us his experience. So I think he's very much alive.
And influential?
Oh, yeah. You know, the American people have gotten from Mr. Bush, Mr. Obama, Mr. Clinton, the kind of Hollywood version of he's running from rock to rock and cave to cave, and he can't communicate. Well, if he was running from rock to rock and cave to cave, we would have killed him, because they're most vulnerable when they move. They make mistakes. And I think the only way you could argue that he can't communicate with his organization is if you haven't been into a Radio Shack in the past 30 years. If a satellite goes over top of you, you can communicate with anyone on Earth.
Do you miss the chase?
Absolutely, sir. My one regret in all of this is that we did not get permission to make him just an annoying memory back in '98 or '99.
Let's, if we could, before we go to calls, expand this just a little bit to the larger war in Afghanistan. The election, the presidential election is happening this month there. What's your view on Hamid Karzai?
Well, he's an effective puppet, an effective figurehead for us. But that's a little strong. But he has very little influence in the country outside of Kabul. His administration would not last very long without the bayonets of NATO. Afghanistan is a very singular place. It's a very much a man's world, and for an Afghan leader to depend on foreign bayonets for his protection is a very negative impression is created among his countrymen.
In the New York Times magazine today is an article, and it says this is Hamid Karzai's regime is the return of the warlords.
Well, what they're saying is that Afghanistan is returning to what it always has been, which is a very regionally, even sub-regionally divided country. One of the goals America has in Afghanistan is a strong central government and an effective national military and political institution. And traditionally, those are the things that cause wars in Afghanistan. And America, in many ways, is historically challenged. We seem not to appreciate that other people have histories that are different than ours.
Stephen Hayes, in the Weekly Standard, writes, a war grows in Afghanistan. He says, the public perception created by such reports is that Afghanistan is a disaster. The problem is that it's not a disaster, it's much, much worse.
The war in Afghanistan, sir, is probably lost. We have tried to do it on the cheap since 9/11. We have a country that's bigger than Texas, has the highest mountains on earth, and has a people that the only thing that unites them is animosity toward occupiers. And when you put those three things together, we are, I think we're very much near defeat. The President's addition of 21,000 more troops will string out the time until we have to make the decision to leave. But I don't think there's any chance of achieving any of the goals we have outlined, whether it's women's rights, parliamentary democracy. You look at the election that's coming up. You really could have an election every other day in Afghanistan for the next 20 years, and it wouldn't make any difference, because it's a tribal society, and that's the way it's going to stay.
So, in your view, should the U.S. let Afghanistan be Afghanistan?
Well, the problem we have, sir, is the one mission we had after 9/11 was to destroy as much of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban as we could. We haven't done that. So I think it's very hard for us to leave now and say, well, we weren't that worried about those fellows anyways. On the other hand, I think we're getting rapidly to the point where Afghanistan is not worth another American life. If you're not going to go in there to win, and honestly, sir, if we're talking about winning, we're talking about 300 to 500,000 American troops and a very aggressive, very bloody war. If we're not willing to do that, I tend to think that American parents have the right to demand their children get out of there.
Michael Scheuer, former chief of the CIA's Counter-Terrorist Center's Bin Laden unit. He resigned in 2004 from the CIA, and he is the author of Imperial Hubris, Why the West is Losing the War on Terror. Matthew in Olympia, Washington, Republican, you're first up.
I have actually two things. One thing, I don't think Bin Laden's alive anymore. I mean, when was the last time you seen him hold up a newspaper with today's date or any date on it? I mean, the guy's been dead for a while, and you're trying to keep him alive. I mean, just for a figure, whatnot. But I mean, the guy has got to be dead. I mean, really. I mean, they have microphone stuff. I mean, really, he's honestly, seriously, let's see this guy hold up a newspaper saying, I'm alive. And another thing, Afghanistan, most people there, anybody who has any brains in their head has left that country a long time ago. And that's the one major problem in Afghanistan.
Well, if you know, I would never say never. Bin Laden might be alive, might be dead, but we do, as a government, a very good job at identifying voices. Voice prints are very well done by the National Security Agency, and they have identified Bin Laden as recently as the last 60 days as his voice being there. So unless he somehow was prescient enough to be able to talk about events that happened long after he was dead and recorded them, I think the odds are is that he is still alive. And I'm sorry I didn't catch the comment on Afghanistan.
I missed the second comment also. I thought he had finished it. We've got a tweet here coming in that says, it's from Tom Peace, can the U.S. be safe from terrorists in Afghanistan if it is a nation of warlords?
Well, yes, it's always been a nation of warlords, and we, you know, whether we're there or not, we remain the strongest power on earth. And if we ran into a problem with the Afghans, we could go back and just punish them and not occupy the country. That's kind of the key here. The mission remains, as I said, what it was. Our mission is to eliminate Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden. Unfortunately, we haven't done that, and in an odd way, the battlefield has grown for us. It used to be just Afghanistan, but now the western third of Pakistan has become part of the theater of operations, and so the problem is immensely more difficult now than it was in 2001.
Chicago, Pearl, Democrat, you're on the air.
Good morning. Yes, Mr. Scheuer, I really have watched your analysis over these years in regards to terrorism, and I really have figured you for one of the good guys. I was really shocked, though, when you made the comments on Fox News. It was something about calling for Bin Laden or Al-Qaeda to attack America to get our attention so that we would be continued to be committed to the terrorist issue. And, you know, mark my words, we are very committed. It's just that the hysteria that we've been put through these last 8 years have not produced a lot of unity among us, actually. I really was saddened to see how overwrought you were in terms of, I don't know what it was. Were you feeling like that that we weren't committed anymore to this? Honestly, I just feel like we are, as a country, committed to this, but we just have to get out of this post-traumatic stress that we all experienced on 9/11 and really be more thoughtful. And really, I recognize that you are an expert in this area, but I was just shocked and saddened to see how overwrought you were on Fox News. And if you could comment on that, I would appreciate it.
Sure. I don't think you watched Fox News. I think you probably saw what the clip that they showed on Olbermann and Jon Stewart, which, you know, you can do anything with video. What I said in a long discussion with Glenn Beck was the American people are not defended adequately by Republicans or Democrats. And the examples we were talking about were our inability to bring wars to conclusions overseas and our failure to control our borders to make sure that none of the enemy gets in. And I said we're in a terrifically odd situation here, astonishingly, that it may take an attack by Osama bin Laden on the United States to wake Americans up to the fact that they keep electing people in both parties who really don't have a commitment to their domestic and national security. And of course, the news readers who pose as analysts and experts on Jon Stewart and Olbermann took that to say that I wanted an attack. If you have listened to me over the years, as you said, you know that that is the furthest thing from the truth.
Jack in Camden, South Carolina, Independent Line. You're on with Michael Scheuer.
Yes, this is a really wonderful conversation. And Michael, I would like to ask you, since you seem to advocate a withdrawal from Afghanistan, exactly what should we do to try to prevent another attack from Al-Qaeda, something that would impact the homeland of the United States or our interests overseas, if it's not going to be direct engagement with these extremists, then in what way can we try to modify the situation and try to establish some type of if not coexistence, then the defeat of their ideology and the seemingly endless pursuit of the destruction of our American culture and way of life.
Let me say, sir, that I don't advocate the withdrawal because I oppose fighting. I would advocate the withdrawal because we don't have a government and haven't had one for the past 20 years that has any kind of realization that war means killing, and we need to do that against our enemies rather than let our own soldiers be targets rather than killers. No one would be more pleased than myself if we took the initiative in Afghanistan and actually hounded these people until we killed enough of them to make them give up. We're not going to do that. We have a lot of people in our ruling elites in both parties who believe you can fight a war without killing the enemy, without suffering any casualties yourself, and by protecting civilians. Well, we now have a general in charge in Afghanistan who has tightened the rules of engagement for our Marines and our soldiers, which will ensure that the enemy gets away and more of our people get killed. What can we do over the long run? We need to accept the truth, sir. We are at war because people hate what we do in the Islamic world, not because we have democracy or freedom at home. And over time, we're going to have to change some of our policies, beginning with energy. If we were more energy self-sufficient, we would have no reason to support Arab tyrants on the Arab Peninsula, for example, the Kuwaitis and the Saudis. So ultimately, as bad as the situation is for us at this moment, it's in our own hands. As long as we allow politicians to tell the American people that this war is about women in the workplace and opposing freedom, we're going to continue to lose because our policies are going to continue to create us more enemies.
What's your take on the book and movie Charlie Wilson's War?
Sir, I was a very junior officer. I worked on the covert action program that supported the Afghans for 7 years, from 1985 to 1992. The book and the movie struck me as very realistic. Mr. Wilson was an extraordinary figure in terms of his influence and his personal character. We would ask for X number of $1 million to support the Afghans, and he would say, no, you mean 10 times X. So I found the book and the movie very, both compelling, interesting, but accurate. Again, but I was a very junior, I was a strap hanger, I was a very junior officer at that time.
John is a Republican in Gastonia, North Carolina. You're on with Michael Scheuer.
Good morning. Yeah, I agree with you. We should get out. All we're doing is losing treasure and blood. I crossed over and voted for Obama. I thought he was new and transparent, but you look what he's doing. He sent his goon squad out, the people who have a right to protest his health bill. And also, Gibbs said the other day, if you speak up against Obama, you're on thin ice. We're getting just the opposite of transparency.
What do you think of President Obama's prosecution of the war in Afghanistan so far? He's committed, what, 4,000 more troops?
Well, I think he's going to send in 17,000 more on the ground and 4,000 to train the Afghan army. Again, I wonder sometimes if Mr. Clinton, Mr. Bush, or Mr. Obama has ever looked at a map of Afghanistan. 21,000 troops is a drop in the bucket. The way we do things now, we're about 3 to 1 in terms of support to fighters. So 21,000 troops is probably about 6,000 or 7,000 shooters. 7,000 fighting men in Afghanistan is a very small number. And as I said earlier, our rules of engagement don't allow us to aggressively pursue the enemy and kill him.
Stephanie, Democrat, Denver. Hi.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. Just a quick comment and a short question. Sir, I believe bin Laden is still alive. And I think that we should use every resource that we have while we are there to try to find him and kill him or get him. And if we had used all of the resources that we've used since September 11th in Iraq, in Afghanistan trying to find him, do you think that we would have killed or caught him by now? And do you think Afghanistan is going the way of Iraq with all of our soldiers seems to be just dying at a higher rate? And thank you for taking my call.
Certainly, I think that it hurt us. As I said earlier, we tried to do Afghanistan on the cheap the Bush administration was far more interested in Iraq than it was in Afghanistan. For example, we were losing people out of our unit at the agency by the spring of 2002 to get ready for the Iraq War. Would we have gotten him? I think the odds are much higher, but there's no certainty in this business. I think it's a near certainty now that we probably don't have enough people on the ground to get him, even with the addition that Senator or President Obama is sending. It's a very difficult job. I think the men and women who are out there are doing their best, but there's just not enough of them, and there's too many other jobs to do in Afghanistan.
Laurel, Maryland is our next call. Independent. Richard, hi.
Hello. My name is Richard from Laurel, Maryland. I'd like your guest to comment on the possibility of the power that our president has to be the commander-in-chief, and that was inherited, or was it inherited from President Bush, when they declared war on terror. And would this be a factor in regards to his sustaining the war on terror, which I think your guest commented to the effect that the war on terror is kind of lost, and I may be wrong on that, but comment on that if you will, and that this power, which was advised pretty strongly by President Cheney, he wanted a stronger presidency, and would Obama be capitalizing on the fact that he does have this War Powers Act? The other thing I'd like him to comment on is what part does the poppy industry over there play in any of this? I appreciate your answer, sir.
Well, I think, I don't think the war on terror is lost. And what we were talking about was the war in Iraq. Unless there is a drastic turnaround in the way we approach that war, I think that particular part of this war is lost. War powers, there was a whole Potemkin argument about the President Bush taking so much power onto himself. And I always thought when the Democrats were criticizing the president for that, what they were criticizing was the fact that the Republicans had the power and they didn't. And I think we've seen now that Mr. Obama intends to renounce none of the powers that President Bush had. He's very comfortable being in the other party having those same powers. And I think that at the bottom, you have to blame the Congress. We have not used the Constitution in war making since 1941. There's no way that one man should be able to take us into war, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, without an absolutely open vote of the Congress. Not a sense of the Congress, not a joint, kind of, okay, Mr. President, you go ahead and do this. We need to have what the Constitution calls for, and that's a direct declaration of war. Make everybody stand up and vote in the Congress. On heroin plays an absolutely important part in what's going on. The Taliban derive a large amount of their income from that. Probably Al-Qaeda derives a large part of it from heroin. It has thoroughly corrupted Mr. Karzai's government. Whether or not he's involved in it personally, the government is thoroughly corrupted by narcotics. And the other problem for the United States is that the various drug-running organizations out of Afghanistan provide Al-Qaeda an alternate logistics system around the world, one that we're not really capable of tracking to the extent we should. So narcotics have always been a very high priority, should have been, but it's not clear to me that they have been over the past decade.
Where did you grow up, and how did you get interested in working for the CIA?
I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and I'll tell you quite frankly, I was finishing my doctorate, and I was working as in British Imperial History. And I was working for Union Carbide as a crane operator in Buffalo, and I was on the third shift in the wintertime. And I applied to any job that came down the road, sir. And I was just extraordinarily fortunate that the agency thought I was a good potential employee. My story is really only in America could this happen. And I've lived an extraordinarily lucky, fortunate life, and I'm very grateful for it.
Our next call, Republican from Ocala, Florida. George is on the line. Please go ahead for Michael Scheuer.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. How is everyone today? I hope fine. I just have one question, and that is the use of Indian troops. I mean, India has the greatest mountain fighters in the world. They could put millions of people in the field. In fact, I think that over time they could, through population osmosis, actually take over the Middle East. And I wonder, because they are on the other side of Pakistan, and it would be a great pincer movement strategically if India made a move towards this bin Laden, if he's still alive. And one of the other question I have, aside from that, is perhaps we are already monitoring bin Laden. Perhaps our intelligence has him on the phone all the time. Perhaps he doesn't know it, but that we are monitoring him. Could that be a possibility?
You know, I wish it was a possibility, but I think it would speak to some kind of nefarious plot if he was on the phone and we hadn't killed him. If he's on the phone and we're listening to him, we can geolocate where he's speaking from, and he would be yesterday's news. He would be dead very quickly. So I seriously doubt whether we're listening to him. The second point I would make is that part of the problem we have in Afghanistan is we've already allowed a large Indian presence in that country, both economically, and they're doing a lot of construction with people that are dressed as civilians, but they're really military engineers. I think people in the United States don't realize the degree of paranoia between two nuclear-armed countries, Pakistan and India, and to allow an Indian military force into Afghanistan would certainly turn the Pakistanis entirely away from us, and they would be supporting our enemies in Afghanistan. So it really is a interesting idea, but I think in the long run it would be a disaster for the United States.
Mr. Scheuer, you said at the beginning of that comment that one of the problems is that a lot of Indians are already in Afghanistan?
Yes. India
Why is that a problem?
Well, Pakistan and India have been at each other's throat since partition in the late 40s. The Pakistanis have always looked at Afghanistan as what they call their strategic depth. If the Indians attack them, they can always fall back to the west. What we have done is allow, under Mr. Karzai's desire, Mr. Karzai went to school in India, to allow a great expansion of the Indian diplomatic presence in Afghanistan, a large amount of Indian investment, and these civilian or pseudo-civilian engineers building roads, which happen to be all along the border with Pakistan. So we've driven the Pakistanis crazy. We've put their enemies on both borders now, from their point of view. And so to jack up the Indian presence in Afghanistan would drive the Pakistanis crazy. And again, you have to remember, we're dealing with two nuclear-armed powers.
Last call from Michael Scheuer. Jim in Redding, California. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. In the approximately 2 years prior to the September 11th attacks by Al-Qaeda there, I read over and over again in the my local newspaper and the Sacramento Bee also about the greatest threat to the American citizens from the terrorists was the use of commercial airlines against our skyscrapers. And if I was that well aware of it, how do you think President Bush could say that he was never made aware of that particular threat?
Well, that threat, of course, occurred under Mr. Clinton's administration, sir, before 9/11. Mr. Bush had a year to do things. The problem Mr. Bush had was not that he wasn't aware of the threat, but that we didn't know where bin Laden was in the year before 9/11. After the Al-Qaeda had almost sunk our destroyer, the Cole, in Yemen, Al-Qaeda had adopted a much more severe regimen of security for their leaders. And so we were unable to tell the president bin Laden is at point X today. That happened a lot under Mr. Clinton. Mr. Bush really didn't have that chance. And so whether he was aware of the plane threat or not, the effort to get bin Laden was severely handicapped in the first year of his presidency because we didn't know where bin Laden was.
And finally, this tweet from Clint David Samuel. Mr. Scheuer, how do you and the CIA distinguish a bad Muslim insurgency, Somalis, Hamas, from a good one, Uyghurs, Chechens?
You know, I think that we don't identify anyone as a good one or a bad one. Our government is the one who decides. People tend to forget that the agency, the CIA, is not an independent agency. It's a function of the executive branch. And we fight and we work where the president tells us to fight. For myself, I think we made a mistake by taking down the Islamic government that was in Somalia a few years ago. Because now we're going to get one that's much worse than the one that was on tap then. But the agency doesn't decide good or bad. The President of the United States, whether he is a Democrat or a Republican, is the one who gives the agency the marching orders they operate by.
What are you doing these days?
I am an adjunct professor at Georgetown. I teach a course there and a couple times a year. I'm writing a biography of Osama bin Laden for Oxford University Press, and I do some training now and then for the U.S. military.
And when is that book due?
It's out. I think it's going to be out in the summer of 2010.
And Michael Scheuer's first book was An Imperial Hubris.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for being on the Washington Journal. President Obama leaves for Guadalajara today, and we'll talk about that next.